Thank you all for coming to what I hope will be an interesting and informative session. I'm Alan Wolf, the director of the Boston Center at Boston College. You know, 1 year can make or break a professional baseball team like the Boston Red Sox. 1 year can totally destroy the success of a TV sitcom. Actually, 1 month can pretty much destroy the success of a TV sitcom. 1 year isn't much in the history and life of the Catholic Church. So it might seem extremely presumptuous to hold a session on Pope Benedict after 1 year. But we do live in an age in which we have instant analysis of just about everything. And so I hope we'll be forgiven for trying to do at least some, not necessarily final statements, certainly not anything like a final statement, but some remarks from our very, very distinguished theologians here at Boston College about Pope Benedict and his start. I'll ask people to give their sense of what he's accomplished so far, what their impressions of his leadership have been, what their hopes are for the Church under his leadership, if there are any disappointments, what those might be, and so on. I'm going to ask our four speakers to speak in reverse alphabetical order. You will immediately figure out that given that my name is Wolf and that every single time I'm on a panel discussion, I have to wait until everyone else has spoken and said everything that I was going to say before finally getting my chance. That I have a certain sympathy for the principle of doing things in reverse alphabetical order, so that will greatly benefit James Weiss, who is part of the one half of our panel, the first two speakers who are native Chicagoans. Professor Weiss is an Episcopal priest, and I'm a director of our capstone program, and he has ministries in 2 different parishes in Boston's Back Bay and in the inner city of Dorchester. And we're very, very honored to have him with us. Ann Hinsdale, who is as I said, a native of Chicago, has been the director of the Institute for Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry from the year 2000 to the year 2003. Before that, she was at Holy Cross, where she was chair of the Religious Studies Department and served as director of Women's Studies. And she also is the author of many, many important works in theology, and especially dealing with women in the church. Father Kenneth Himes is the chair of the theology department. His PhD is in religion and public policy from Duke University, which I mention only because of my happiness that Duke University did not win either for the women's team. But I hear, Ken, they have great opportunity on the lacrosse team. All kinds of Ken Himes is not from Chicago, but I understand from Brooklyn, a place where I lived for many, many years. Tom Groome is neither from Chicago nor from Brooklyn. You know where he's from the minute he opens his mouth. He's currently the director of the Institute for Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry, and of course a widely known author of many, many books dealing with issues of Catholic spirituality. So I will ask James Weiss to begin, and then we'll proceed in the order that I listed.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Alan. I'd like to present an overview of Benedict's first year from my perspective as a church historian and as a specialist in the modern papacy and the history of conclaves. And that will provide, I hope, a framework for my colleagues' more particular comments on specific aspects of Benedict. There's a chronological summary of highlights and themes that I've prepared, which is available as a handout, and I hope you have one. In December, a Roman journalist encountered an out-of-town cardinal on a street in Rome, and the cardinal had not been back since the conclave, and he seized the journalist, whom he trusted, and he said, "What is Benedict doing? When is he going to make any changes?" The fact is that Benedict has kept a fairly low profile. So we must be careful in assessing Benedict's first year because his major agenda was already set by John Paul II. The World Youth Day, the Bishop's Synod on the Eucharist, the decree on homosexuals in the priesthood, and even the famous encyclical on love were already in the works. Benedict only finished up on John Paul's commitments, even though he had, of course, largely influenced them in the first place. And yet, if the substance of this first year has been predetermined, the style was not. Benedict's style brought a major surprise. He has not lowered the boom. He has not cracked down on persons or trends in the church, as expected. And on numerous occasions when he could have denounced the culture of relativism, he has conspicuously refrained from doing so. He has not even practiced his own liturgical preferences, even though he is known as a critic of the current liturgy. Let me give 3 compelling examples of his restraint. First, when his encyclical on love appeared, my Protestant friend asked me, what did he condemn this time? In fact, the encyclical passed up the chance to touch the hot-button issues and praised sexual love. Who knew? Second, at the World Youth Day, Benedict's major sermon encouraged the young to Eucharist and church, but he did not denounce contemporary youth culture as expected. And third, he has muted his positions on Islamic influence in Europe. Another point on Benedict's style. John Paul tried to be the pastor of the planet. Benedict tries to be a self-effacing steward of a tradition. Benedict does not see Western history culminating in his own millennial significance, as John Paul did. Rather, for Benedict, being Pope is about the office, not the personality. Less autocratic, he seems genuinely to want more consultation with his cardinals and bishops. And even his liturgical style focuses on the sacred mystery rather than the sacred minister. For many, this style comes as a distinct relief. And so I'll finish by naming some key themes in Benedict's message and some key events with significance for the future. You have more on your menu than we can possibly cover, but I'd like to select what I think are the key themes and the key events. I will skip the encyclical because that will be discussed by my colleagues, and so I'd like to name 3 key themes from Benedict's other pronouncements so far. The first theme has vast significance inside the church, and it may prove to be the hermeneutic for his entire pontificate. In his Christmas address to the Roman Curia, he devoted himself to the legacy of Vatican II, just 40 years past. And he said that the wrong way to view the council was as a break from the past. The proper way is to view the council as being in deep continuity with the church tradition and the teaching of the church. He repudiated the phrase following the spirit of the council and encouraged people to follow the texts of the council. He also named the 3 great accomplishments of the council as being the healing of divisions between faith and science, between church and state, and between Christianity and other religions. A second theme may prove to be a hermeneutic for his dealings both inside and outside of the church. The theme of true and false freedom, first articulated in Gaudium et Spes, was inscribed in Ratzinger's writings as a theologian, a cardinal, and also in his motto as a bishop. It surfaced repeatedly this year, and so we must listen. True freedom for Benedict never means autonomy. It means the capacity to accept and surrender to clear and unambiguous truth. And those are his words, to accept and surrender. And third, a theme of vast importance, the Eucharist is central to all of Benedict's teaching. As for key events, apart from predictable actions like the decree on homosexuals and the creation of new cardinals, here are the key actions. First, true to his gentler side, one that has been vastly misunderstood prior to his papacy, Benedict has moved cautiously in reorganizing the Roman Curia, but he has begun it. Second, he has called for a synod on Africa to consider not merely evangelization there, but also the issues of global justice. Third, he shows genuine concern to restart the progress of Catholic Orthodox dialogue, one that was severely aggravated and debilitated by John Paul II. Fourth, in Jewish-Christian relations, he is totally committed to the Jewish-Christian religious dialogue, but he considers that Vatican-Israel relations are a tough diplomatic matter and has not granted requests made by the President of Israel and the chief rabbis of Israel. Fifth, he has also taken a tough stand on some Islamic issues. He even decided to walk right into the lion's den by accepting an invitation to visit Turkey in November of this year. As a cardinal, he had opposed Turkey's admission to the European Union because it is not a Christian nation. And he has also called Islamic nations to task for their lack of reciprocity. I'll finish now simply by mentioning the themes that have not yet been officially addressed and which leave us wondering which way he'll go. Clergy sexual abuse, the bishop's delinquency in addressing that issue, the status of women in the church, and liturgical reform. And I hope we'll have time for lots of discussion in the questions and answers. Thank you.
That time of year when students are writing term papers and exams and professors are grading them. I even see a couple of my students who are getting extra credit for coming to this panel in the audience today. Now, I love teaching, but I've always hated grading. Nevertheless, it's an occupational hazard that I've simply come to accept. So I thought I'd begin my remarks not perhaps as erudite and well-researched as my colleague Jim Weiss, by giving a Pope a grade for the first year of his pontificate. I do this with some daring. After all, I've already been proved wrong. Three of us were on a panel just before the conclave, and I predicted, or I espoused the hope that we would have a weak Pope instead of a strong Pope, and I don't think that has come true. But anyway, I thought I'd begin by giving the Pope a grade, and I want to say that I think he deserves a C+++. Now, that's not a grade that we give here at BC. And furthermore, lest I be misquoted, whoever's covering this for the Heights, listen up, or misunderstood, particularly in this era of grade inflation. I don't see Dean Quinn here, because I wanted to get credit for not giving something above a C. I want to remind everyone that the grade of C, of course, means average, and it was also used to signify in those bad old days when schools like BC were all male, a sort of gentlemanly C was regarded as a way of saying not much of significance had been achieved, but the student was giving a passing grade for showing up. Now, you've noticed I've added pluses to this grade because I would like to emphasize what I think, and this does go beyond average, what I think are the three pluses that I've so far seen in the Ratzinger papacy. And they have to do with three C's: culture, consultation, and continuity. I'll leave it to you to ascertain whether you think these pluses constitute an above average mark. In the first part of this commentary, like Professor Weiss, I want to make a series of observations organized around these C pluses. In the second, briefer part, I want to indicate some hopes that I still hold out in relation to some other possible C work yet to be submitted. And those I'm going to express as concerns and challenges that I think this papacy still needs to deal with. I also want to make a caveat. I had outlined the remarks I'm going to make before I saw John Allen's March 30th assessment of the first year of the Pope in the March 30th National Catholic Reporter. However, I do make some comments that are similar to his. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it to you. It's a very astute commentary. Culture. We probably all recall that a year ago in his pre-conclave homily, the then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger referred to the dictatorship of relativism that recognizes nothing as absolute and which leaves only the I and its whims as the ultimate measure. He exhorted the cardinals before the conclave began, and actually Catholics in general, to an adult faith, a faith rooted in friendship with Christ, a friendship which gives us the measure to discern between what is true and what is false. And I quote, he said, "How many winds of doctrine we have known in these last decades, how many ideological currents, how many fashions of thought. The small boat of thought of many Christians has often remained agitated by the waves, tossed from one extreme to the other, Marxism to liberalism to libertinism, from collectivism to radical individualism, from atheism to a vague religious mysticism, from agnosticism to syncretism." A question I have is, and I would agree with Professor Weiss, we haven't seen any, in practical terms, follow-up to this kind of condemnation of culture. And so I hold out a hope that the Pope, in fact, is still in touch with culture. I take some measure of hope from the fact that Cardinal Thomas Williams of Wellington, New Zealand, called him a bilingual pope. Actually, he's multilingual. But in fact, what he meant was he can speak the language of Scripture and tradition and the fathers, as well as the culture of the barbarians. Now, you may not like that designation for us, but in fact, he has been listening to the culture. With regard to consultation, Benedict appears to be interested in consultation and the possibility of there being perhaps even a consensus on some of the divisive and neuralgic issues in the Church. For example, at the Synod on the Eucharist, he allowed a time for open discussion each evening, and issues such as ordaining married men and admittance to communion under certain circumstances of the divorced and remarried were voiced by the bishops present there. He seemed to be listening carefully to what the bishops had to say, though it must be noted that nothing, in fact, has changed on either of those two subjects. Also, at the recent consistory, in which he elevated 15 new cardinals, he noted that he wanted to discuss such issues with the cardinals as the late French Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre and his followers with regard to possible reconciliation within the Church, the situation of Islam. He also mentioned something that perhaps doesn't seem to be very important on our radar screen, namely the mission of retired bishops in the Church. However, I think in the United States context, given that the bishops who have just recently retired or who are retiring or about to retire are the last remnant of the bishops who were raised to the episcopate under Archbishop Jadot, who was the apostolic delegate at the time, really reflects a real possible change that perhaps Benedict is wanting to harness or muzzle these retired bishops who are still alive but do not have a specific role in the Church. That would be very problematic. Finally, the third C, continuity and contrast. Compared to John Paul II, I think there are a number of places that I see contrast. Benedict is a very humble man, and I say this having talked to a number of people who actually know him well. He is also very erudite and cultured and a true teacher, as well as, I would say, even though I am not in complete agreement always, a really good theologian. He knows his stuff. In the article that John Allen wrote recently, he said that it's interesting that although he lacks the charismatic leadership qualities that John Paul II has had, people still flock to hear him in his Wednesday audiences in which he is undertaking a new catechesis. And I've read several of these, and they are actually really well articulated, and there's nothing that I have found that I could theologically, in any case, disagree with. The concerns and challenges that I have, they complement actually these three C's of culture, consultation, and continuity. Will he really continue to listen to culture that comprises the actual experience of people? Here I am thinking, for example, of a person that was not appointed by him, was appointed by John Paul II, the head of the Congregation for Religious. It's a congregation that has a much longer name than just that, but that will do for now. Cardinal Rode, who is, I believe, a Slovenian cardinal. He was just one of the new cardinals named. And Cardinal Rode made some comments with regard to how he sees religious operating in the world. These are what we would colloquially call nuns or Catholic sisters. And one of the things he said that I found very disturbing was he said that after the council, the sisters basically have taken on a secularist kind of role in the world. And they need to return, in a sense, to the true meaning of their apostolic and consecrated life. And he would like to see, as is happening in the births of some new forms of religious life, a return to the religious habit, a return to explicit church activities, and would not like to see sisters as involved as they have been in social justice. I bring him up because at the same time, and perhaps you read about this, the Canadian religious men and women issued a very interesting statement that they presented. Originally it was supposed to be private, but it was publicized, it was leaked to the press, of issues that they wanted their bishops, when they made their ad limina visit to the Pope, that is the visit bishops make every 5 years from particular dioceses, to bring to their attention. And these are really wonderful, I don't have time to go into it now, statements of what it might mean for the Pope to listen to a culture. They are articulating issues that they believe the church is in danger of becoming totally irrelevant, particularly to the younger generation. Will he continue, or what will really be the method of consultation? Is it merely, as one bishop recently explained to me, a matter of flying above the fray and letting the underlings in the various congregations of the Curia to do the dirty work? I can give 2 examples, but I don't want to take the time now, and just briefly of this. One being from the conversations that a bishop, Ken Utner, a good friend of mine who died 2 years ago, had with Cardinal Ratzinger when he was summoned to Rome on a number of occasions to explain things that weren't going well in the diocese or that had been complained about, and basically said it was a wonderful conversation with Cardinal Ratzinger. However, the other persons in the congregation were the ones who actually did the dirty work, and when he got home, there were all kinds of condemnations that came forth, but they had not come from Ratzinger himself. Another concerns a specific issue of a priest in Haiti, one who has been accused of by his own bishop of being too involved in politics, and the role of Cardinal Ratzinger in the Congregation for the Clergy there, where the head of the Congregation for the Clergy, in a sense, is doing the dirty work, and Cardinal Ratzinger has hands off. The third question or concern or challenge is with regard to continuity, and I guess I didn't really say it well, that there is continuity. I mean, that's been made clear by the statements that Pope Benedict XVI has said between his papacy and John Paul II's. But will this also disallow any development of doctrine? This is something, again, that Ratzinger, as a good theologian, knows, in fact, will and must happen. In the past, he's viewed feminism as simply radical feminism. Now he seems to have adopted John Paul II's view on complementarity as being at the heart of a true feminism. And of course, this has come through. He's re-articulated the notion of complementarity. In a short form, we can say it means that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. That he has reiterated that theory, not so much around issues having to do with women, but in the whole issues concerning gay marriage or the gay parenting instruction. On the other hand, we can assume that he did have a role as head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in the appointment of the first 2 women to the International Theological Commission, Barbara Hansen-Leben of Switzerland and Sarah Butler of the United States. However, both of these 2 theologians are on record as being very much opposed to the possibility of women's ordination, and the Pope seems to, in a recent utterance that I just was made aware of by Jim Weiss before our meeting today, to simply still concur with that. On the other hand, I think it's important for people to realize that actually women have assumed, particularly in not only the United States, but in big numbers in the United States, but in almost every other country in the world, the role of theologian in the church. And this is a very important ministry, I think, as we all know. So while women cannot, at least for the present, be ordained in the Catholic Church, they certainly can become theologians, which is something that I keep reminding my students about. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I want to not repeat the comments of Jim and Mary Ann, although a number of the things they said I just allude to. But basically, I want to group my comments under three headings. One, the promise of this papacy. Second, a risk this papacy is running. And third, a certain foreboding that I have about the papacy. First, promise. As has been mentioned both by Jim and Mary Ann, among the things that has not happened in this papacy is any real crackdown on the theological community in any significant way. In fact, the most public act regarding the theological community was Benedict's 4-hour meeting and dinner with Hans Groome, the Swiss theologian who's been persona non grata in the Vatican for more than 2 decades. Groome had asked to have meetings with John Paul II on repeated occasions and was always refused. Benedict met with him, as I said, for more than 4 hours, and what all reports said was a very cordial conversation. That's because, I think, the promise here is that Benedict does listen. Many of those people who voted for him in the conclave, when asked why Benedict got their support, a common response was precisely that in their dealings with him, they found that in fact he was a man who listened to them carefully and responded courteously. So far, I think that's largely been proven true in the way he's operated as Pope. He distinguishes dogma and doctrine from pastoral judgment. And while he's very stalwart, obviously, in defending the first two, he seems quite dialogical on the issue of pastoral judgment. Mary Ann mentioned in several ways, in terms of the Episcopal Synod on the Eucharist, in which he had extra meetings as listening sessions, as well as the meeting prior to the last consistory. Jim mentioned the Special Synod on Africa. But I think an also very important point here, speaking about Africa, was an incident that's not been widely reported here in the West. And that is, not long after Benedict was Pope, he was receiving the credentials of the newest ambassador from Zimbabwe to the Vatican. And in his remarks to the new ambassador, he praised Zimbabwe for the recent election they had held. That election had been criticized strongly by the Bishops' Conference of Zimbabwe. That the Mugabe administration had run a corrupt and indeed false election. Following Benedict's comments, Archbishop Nkube of Zimbabwe was in the Vatican and face-to-face confronted Benedict on this point and told him he was dead wrong in praising the Mugabe regime's election. Benedict listened to that, and not long after it, made a point of publicly praising the Zimbabwe bishop's pastoral letter in which they criticized Mugabe's actions in land reform and his treatment of the poor. Those sorts of things, it seems to me, suggest that Benedict is more dialogical than John Paul II, who, as we know, sort of went his own way on pastoral strategies and largely operated with a very small, tight kitchen cabinet that he consulted. Benedict seems far more interested in wider consultation with his fellow bishops. So that's the promise, that we have a man here who listens. A risk. The risk, I think, is the game he's beginning to play with Islam. The lack of religious freedom in Muslim states deeply rankles many in the Vatican, especially after the Saudi Arabians bankrolled what is now the largest mosque in Europe, built not very far from the Vatican. and the Vatican raised no complaints about this. And yet, as we know, there is actually no, in practice, religious freedom in Saudi Arabia for Christians. Indeed, members of Catholic religious orders cannot wear clerical garb on the streets of Saudi Arabia. Chaplains in the U.S. military must take off all religious insignia before they leave military bases in Saudi Arabia. These sorts of things rankle the Vatican, at least certain members of the Vatican, strongly. There also was an incident that got reported here but had nowhere near the emotional impact here that it had in Italy. And that was the assassination of Andrea Santoro, an Italian missionary in Turkey, not long after the situation with the cartoon about the Prophet Muhammad. That was a big deal in Italy. Santoro had been the subject of a TV special for his work in Islam, working with people in Islam in Turkey. He was seen as something of a hero among many people in the Italian Catholic Church. His death was really an incident that raised, you might say, the concerns that many people in Western Europe have about bringing Turkey into the European Union and whether or not there really can be religious freedom for Christians in Arab countries. Another concern that the Vatican has is the declining population of Christians in Arab lands. The Christian population in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Iraq, are all under decline for various reasons, no singular reason. But certainly one of the reasons is the perception that there is Muslim pressure playing a role on driving Christians out in certain countries. For those reasons, Benedict is starting to play a much tougher game in terms of his relationships with Islam than John Paul did. John Paul was far more conciliatory in his actions towards Islam than it appears Benedict XVI is going to be. I'm not judging whether that's right or wrong. I'm just suggesting that there's a risk there, obviously. And it's not clear at this point how that's going to play itself out. But it's something I think that we need to watch in terms of the direction of this papacy. My final comment is a matter of foreboding. It has to do with the first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est. It's an encyclical that's gotten praised for lots of reasons, and many good ones. For Benedict, as Mary Ann mentioned, truth is the corrective to the dictatorship of relativism, the term that he used in his homily just before the cardinals went into conclave that elected him. But the interesting thing is that the way that Benedict is presenting this is not truth being used coercively to bind people's freedom, but rather truth is the way to really love people well. There are truths about the human person that we ignore at our peril. Without truth, there can be no genuine peace nor real justice in society, according to Benedict. So truth as the condition for peace and justice were in fact the themes both of his first World Day of Peace message in January and then the annual address that the Pope gives to the international community of diplomats accredited to the Vatican each January. For Benedict, relativism undercuts moral truths that must be understood if we are to love smartly. An example here would be Benedict's insistence that human rights are universal. They are not just a Western cultural concept. This is precisely the reason for his concerns about religious freedom in Islamic nations. The encyclical was in many ways a laudable document, but there is an ironic emphasis on one point, and that is his, might say, exaltation of charity to the point of eclipsing justice. That leads to my comment about foreboding. Benedict suggests that the church does charity, the state does justice. For some time, the separation of church and state has been a commonplace. But it is not clear that it can be treated analogously as a neat separation of charity and justice. In his own commentary on the encyclical, 1 week after it was issued, Benedict said, quote, "Without engaging in politics, the church participates passionately in the battle for justice." he seems to think that the institutional church does not engage in politics in its pursuit of justice, largely because he thinks the church plays the role of teacher rather than actor. Now, I think Benedict's emphasis here is ironic, because Italian politics is a very important strategic front right now for the Vatican's concern about the European loss of Christian sensibilities. A couple of illustrations. The head of the Italian Episcopal Conference, Cardinal Rumini, who was a key factor in the election of Benedict XVI, has been very engaged in several matters of Italian politics this past year, including a nationwide referendum on methods of fertility assistance. Secondly, Benedict met with Marcello Pera, who is the head of the Italian Senate, who is a key ally of Silvio Berlusconi, the present leader of Italy. This was the first time in 40 years that a pope met with an Italian politician during election season. It hadn't happened since Paul VI met with Aldo Moro and the Christian Democrats. Third, the Vatican played a very strong role in this recent referendum in Italy on fertility assistance. It's likely to do so again if Berlusconi's party is re-elected, since there have been informal promises from Berlusconi to the Vatican that there will be a reopening of the question of divorce in Italian law, as well as abortion. Fourth, Episcopal conferences worldwide do what can only be described as lobbying on any number of issues, from trade agreements to debt relief, from military budgets to social welfare programs. There are Episcopal conferences all over the world that are heavily involved in lobbying on these questions in their various with their various national governments. Finally, the Vatican itself runs its own school of diplomacy, and in the last 100 years has played a role in all manner of negotiations between nations and within international organizations. Let me suggest that in closing, that better than Benedict's formulation in the encyclical, that the church doesn't do justice, the state does that because that involves politics, and we do charity. Better than that, I think, is the way Vatican II put the question in the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. That is, according to the teaching of Vatican II, clearly the church has no direct political mission. Indirectly, however, through its proclamation of religious teachings on creation, incarnation, Trinity, and other doctrines, the church has a political role. That is, defending human dignity, protecting human rights, promoting human unity, providing meaning to everyday life for human beings, are all spillover effects of the church's teaching on the nature of God and the nature of humankind. Such activity necessarily brings one into the realm of politics, and we should not apologize for that, nor act as if we don't do it. Thank you.
Well, coming last in such a distinguished line of speakers, I want to begin by saying that I now know how my friend Fred Zipkowski and Mary Ann Zaccarelli feel on such occasions. So, Alan, this has been instructive when you come at the end of the alphabet. And I didn't know that these people were going to steal so many of my points and my notes before I even got to speak. But being a person of few words, I'm going to keep to my 5 to 7 minutes that Alan instructed us to keep to. And let's see if I can manage that and then open the floor to you. Seriously, many of the points I was going to make have been made so well by my colleagues already. But that has never prevented me from speaking before, so we still will have a little to say. It brought me back to a memory of when the very moment, in fact about 3 minutes after Pope Benedict was elected, because like my colleagues, I had been in the public forum with loud and long predictions, all of them of course well informed by John Hallam's misinformation to us, and I had my list of 12 papabile all lined up, because NPR had asked a commitment from me that within 2 or 3 minutes after the announcement that I would in fact come on the air and make a comment. But the last person I expected to be elected was Cardinal Ratzinger. So when I heard from the balcony of St. Peter's, Cardinale Joseph, I said, oh God, where are my notes? And I couldn't believe it was true, and many of us couldn't. We didn't think the cardinals would elect Cardinal Ratzinger, that in fact he'd been far too controversial and somewhat of a bellwether of controversy in the church and so on. And so here I found myself literally 3 minutes later, on the air in public radio, commenting. And of course, instead of bopping, I remember quite vividly what I said. I won't repeat it, but I'll give you the gist of it. I began by saying, well, as a loyal Catholic Christian, of course I accept this man as our Pope, and I give him my allegiance, my loyalty, my prayers, my good wishes, and I presume that all of my brother and sister Catholics will do likewise. He is our elected Pope, and of course we will accept him and support him and pray for him. However, I would be less than honest if I didn't express some surprise at this selection, and I'm sure many of my fellow and sister Catholics will be equally surprised, and many indeed disappointed by this. But who knows, and this was my closing line about 20 minutes later, he may surprise us again, and he may continue to surprise us. And I think it was probably the least adventuresome comment I could have made, to say that, well, maybe he'll surprise us. And in a sense, I think he has not surprised us, and my colleagues have laid out many of the ways in which he has been somewhat predictable. But I think there are some ways in which he has surprised us, and my colleagues have also mentioned some of those as well. Among other things, I think is surprising is the slow start that he has made. Because he certainly gave us the impression as Cardinal Ratzinger that he felt there were many things seriously awry and wrong with the church, and I think we just presumed that he would rush in to fix them upon being elected as Pope, Benedict XVI. That indeed he was ready to roll, as it were. And instead of that, I mean, he hasn't. It's been fairly uneventful, as Jim pointed out. He hasn't rushed in to fix things that he thought were broken. In fact, he seems to be taking his time. And although he's in good health, the man is pushing 80, so he must know that he has a limited number of years. But I think he does know that he is a transitional pope, because he knows that all popes are transitional popes, and that he knows that there were popes before him, and there will be popes after him, and that he doesn't need to fix it all, or put his indelible mark upon it all. And in many ways, the late John Paul II of happy memory sometimes gave us the impression that he thought he had to get it all done before his own going home to God, and that so much depended upon him putting a certain stamp and hue upon the life and ethos of the church. Benedict seems in some ways to be more of a pope than John Paul was, more in keeping with the tradition of the papacy, not speaking his own personal theology as readily, because he knows that he's now representing the consensus faith of our church, and that then his own personal theological opinions may not in fact they reflect the sensus fidelium and the research of the scholars, and indeed a good consensus of the faith handed down. So I don't think you're going to see Benedict publishing books of happy thoughts and about his childhood and his sources of hope and so on, the way that John Paul did. And often to the confusion of people, I was asked many times, well, is this papal teaching? Well, it's the Pope that wrote it, but is it papal teaching? Well, no, it's kind of personal opinion. Well, that's kind of unfortunate in a sense. Somebody had told me the anecdote, I don't know whether it's true or not, that Pope John Paul II, in one of his early encyclicals, was attempted to use, or perhaps did use, I forget, the first person singular, so I rather than the papal we, and asked Karl Rahner about it, and Rahner cautioned him against that said, no, the Pope shouldn't speak as an I. He should speak the we. He should speak the consensus faith of the church. I think Benedict is much more likely to do that, and I think the first year seems to have borne that out. than in fact John Paul was prone to do. Now, there are lots of things that I wish he would rush to fix. And again, my colleagues have mentioned a number of them, issues that beset our world and society, that certainly beset our church, and it seems that he's going to be more likely to address church issues. So we're still waiting for him to recenter the role of the bishops, for example, the bishops' conferences, to offset the enormous recentralizing of power that went back into the Roman Curia, especially by the end of the pontificate of John Paul II. We're hoping that Benedict will return to the spirit, or shall I say the text, of Vatican II in that regard. Either one would so advise that he reinstates the role of the local bishop and of bishops' conferences, and, as I said, decentralize the power of the Curia and so on, all of which the progress that has been made toward that was largely undone by the end of John Paul's pontificate, for whatever reason. Perhaps the man was sickly and so on, and other people stepped in to fill the power vacuum, or for whatever reason it was. We're hoping that Benedict, of course, will undo some of that. Issues, again, and you can have your own push-button issues regarding women's rights, gender issues, the shortage of priests, the restructuring of ministry. It's the elephant in the living room of our church. The shortage of priests in quantity and quality, and what will become of our church, especially as a sacramental community, if that simply is allowed to continue unabated. Certainly at the crisis point in some parts of the world than others, but that he would address those. Obviously, we're waiting for him to do that, to restore public trust in our church, and especially public accountability in the aftermath of the scandals and so on. So all of that remains to be done, and I think he'll move along with it and take his time with it and do something with those issues. I have a prediction, actually, but I'll come back to at the end if you stay with me. I have a prediction. You'll have heard it here first, I think, and so stay with it. I'll keep that till the end. I think there are two assets that I want to raise up from this past year. My colleagues have referred to both of them in one way or another, and both of them are ambivalent or ambiguous, and indeed you could say on the one hand, but on the other hand. But I want to go to my first asset that I think it will be a lasting legacy of his pontificate, even as the critiques that Ken has raised and the cautions about it are indeed well taken and in place. I think the asset of Deus Caritas Est is that he returns us to this foundation of our faith. In a sense, I wish he had written the first part of that encyclical and skipped the second. It would have been a brilliant encyclical if he had. The second is where he begins to distinguish between the call to justice and to caritas, to charity. It seems to say that, as Ken indicated, that one is the job of the church, the other is the job of society, and in a sense never the twain shall meet, except through the church's effort to educate people's conscience, the consciences of its members, that's how we influence the public realm. And even misquotes that old text of render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God's, as the justification. And of course my scripture scholar friends tell me it's a complete misinterpretation of that text to use it to divide the secular from the sacred, or the church from society, or justice from charity, and so on. On the other hand, at the end of the encyclical, and then I'll come back to the first part of it where I think the asset lies, at the end of the encyclical he comes back, in a sense, it's as if he realizes that he cannot undo and doesn't want to undo the church's teaching in social justice. Even if he wanted to, he couldn't, because it has been so well established since 1891 and Rerum Novarum of Leo XIII, and then the synods and so on, declaring that the commitment to justice is a constitutive aspect of Catholic Christian faith. In other words, that it's not a Catholic faith we're preaching or trying to live if it doesn't entail the demand of justice and of social justice. So he recognizes that, it seems to me, but at the end of it he comes back and he says, but you know, if the whole world was indeed ordered justly, there still would be a need for charity. And I was kind of taken by that maybe, given him a slight benefit of the doubt for now, was his intent. He says that, I have a quote here, he says, love, caritas, will always prove necessary, even in the most just society. There is no ordering of the state so just that it can eliminate the need for a service of love. And I had just finished reading that when a friend of mine who was struggling with cancer called me. And I found myself offering the kind of sympathy and care and concern and prayers and assurance of solidarity and friendship that any one of you would offer. But when I got off the phone, I realized that in a sense, yes, even if justice prevailed in our society, there'll still be people who will come down with cancer, with dreadfully destructive diseases, whose relationships will fall apart, who they will face the tragedies of life, and that even in the most just of societies, we will still be called to this mandate of charity. I suppose, but it'd be nice if he said that charity should be the icing on the cake of justice, rather than making it sound as if these are two different demands of the gospel, one to be fulfilled in society and one in the church. And of course, it becomes an issue for the sacramentality of the church when the church itself ceases to be just, or to be seen to be just in the eyes of the world. We contradict ourselves and become a less credible sign of that which we preach. However, in the first part of the encyclical, I love what he does, because in a sense, I think he's transcending the beliefs, the issues, the controversies that might divide us and for which he might chastise people, and instead is bringing us to this deep foundation. This foundation that God is a God of love, and not only a God who is love, but a God who is in love with us, and that we are to live our lives in response to the love of God, by loving God, loving each other, loving ourselves, and that this is possible because we are made in the image and likeness of God, who is love, and that our ultimate human vocation is to love and to be loved. Now, in a sense, it's stating the obvious, isn't it? But yet, to bring us to that kind of foundation, I felt, gives us the possibility of finding common ground, common cause, standing together in this great foundation of our faith, rather than in the controversies and the debatable issues, which are terribly important. Years ago, I was a young faculty member here. I came from doing doctoral work at Columbia and Union Theological Seminary, and Bernard Lonergan was never even on a reading list, never mind being required reading. But I found myself at Boston College, where, of course, Lonergan was such a significant presence, and I decided, he was teaching here at the time, a wonderful, gentle, older man when I met him, and I took 3 different courses with Lonergan. They were a great benefit to my life, and I loved him and loved his work. But I remember one day in class, this very dense young academic asked him a very turgid kind of question, like, what is the existential criterion for the empirical adequacy of the hermeneutical principle in the existential situation? And I remember Lonergan blinking and then saying, oh, love. Love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. He always ended up, love yourself, heart of stone must become the heart of flesh. I remember we all sitting there writing it down. Isn't this crazy? But in a sense, this old, extraordinary scholar, one of the finest scholars of any time in the history of our church, maybe it was in the end of his days that he came back to that, but I remember thinking, God, he's right. You know, shouldn't love be the ultimate criterion in hermeneutic? I think Benedict tries to do some of that, at least in the beginning of it. And of course he writes glowingly about eros, and insists that eros and agape have the same divine source. And that's welcome. In Catholic documents, we've written about marriage as if it was between 2 angels. He actually, when you read the language that he uses to describe, he's obviously talking about sexual intercourse. It is downright poetic, as Bob and Belly mentioned in his review in America. It's a glowing, extraordinary language for human lovemaking. It's clearly written by a celibate, I would say, but that's not true, I'm sure. But it's just this extraordinary sense. Now he does say that eros has to be subsumed into agape. And again, those of you who are a little while married know that that's pretty much the agenda of the day, isn't it? And, but it's just an amazing... so if you read it, I would say read the first part of that and know that there's an extraordinary legacy there, even though the second part is controversial. My second asset, I'm not keeping my word thing, but let me just mention it very briefly. The second asset is this sense that there are great truths. Now, does he know as many of them as he claims to know? Are they as absolute as he thinks they are? But I find this pushing back against this dictatorship of relativism, even though Jim is right, he hasn't used the term since that election, that sermon that got him elected in a sense. But yet, I find it terrifying if we move to a kind of an easy posture that all truth is of human construct and that it's all contextual and relative to the situation. I think that's an invitation to destructive ideologies that will rise up to terrify us and to destroy us. That there has to be non-negotiable truths upon which we stand and on which we ground our lives and for which we would give our lives. Otherwise, the relativity of it all. Now, we can caricature postmodernity as saying that, and of course lots of postmodern authors don't say that at all. Nobody's more adamant about the responsibilities we have to the other than Emmanuel Levinas, for example, a great postmodern author. So it's not as if postmodernity has called us into relativism and he's to push back against it, although he sometimes gives that impression. And yet, saying that, no, there are great truths that are non-negotiable. I think that's an extraordinary asset and a service to us. There was a famous case some years ago, about 4 years ago, as a report in the New York Times, of two women philosophers at Brigham Young University. I don't mean to pick on Brigham Young. It could happen at any one of our faith-identified universities. I think, at least on a bad day, it could. But two women at Brigham Young University in the philosophy department were denied tenure. And they took the university to court. And the university, in its defense, quoted their own writings against them, saying, well, you claim yourself that truth is contextual, that freedom is relative, that justice is a matter of construct. And in our context, our truth is the Book of Mormon, and you've clearly violated it and written against it, and contrary to its teachings, and therefore you're fired. But I thought it was so ironic that they could take the writings of these fine philosophers, people who deserve tenure by other criteria, and turn it against them. It's a slippery slope, and that he's pushing back against it, I think, is an asset. Oh, my prediction. You heard it here first. I could imagine him, because he knows the tradition so well, putting together a Blue Ribbon Commission to at least investigate the possibility of women being ordained to the diaconate in the Catholic Church. I think he's watching the developments in the Eastern traditions very closely, at least from what I can gather. And apparently our Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters are moving fairly quickly as they move, to the ordination of women. Now, I have friends who would say that that would be pure tokenism, but I think it would be a lovely token. And we've always insisted in our Catholic theology that the diaconate is a participation in the sacrament of holy orders. And I think women being admitted to the diaconate would be very significant. I could imagine him, because he knows the tradition as well as he does, because he's the fine theologian that he is, and because of his efforts at rapprochement with the Eastern Orthodox traditions, he'll certainly be confronted by it. And I could imagine him even doing something about it. Of course, I've been wrong many times before. Thank you.
Well, it's usually the custom in these kind of events to ask the panelists to confront each other a little bit and to explore their disagreements. It's also the custom for the moderator, me, to have a million questions, which in fact I have. But I actually think this is the time perhaps to break with those conventions and proceed directly to questions from the audience, because I really saw this event right from the very beginning as one in which we could, as a community, participate in the discussion. So if there are questions, and if people want to move to one of the microphones, Tim, no, do you want to start? Steve?
Do any of you see significance in Cardinal Ratzinger's giving communion to Brother Roger Teze, who's not Catholic?
You're the liturgist. Huh?
No, I'm not a liturgist. I don't know if I'd make too much of those kinds of gestures, Tim, in truth. You know, John Paul II used to give as gifts when Anglican priests and Anglican bishops visited the Vatican. He used to give them stoles. He was not about to recognize Anglican orders. You know, sometimes those gestures are less than they purport to be, rather than more.
I could say a word on that. The staging of that was apparently rather spontaneous, and Ratzinger was caught off guard, and in the heat of the moment, as it were, he went ahead and did something that he himself didn't approve of, according to the commentators who finessed it afterwards. The other thing is that the Synod, I mean, if there was any doubt about where he stands, the Synod of Bishops has explicitly, in October, explicitly disallowed intercommunion with Protestants.
Which of the two of you got to your microphone first?
Age before beauty.
That's me, I guess. First of all, I want to say there's something we should miss about John Paul, which is that he had a repentance, a spirit of repentance for the church in its history. That to me was a great breath of fresh air. And I find in this encyclical, we're back to the old triumphalism. The church is the expert on charity. Everybody else kind of does the second-class ethics. And I find it's unfair to groups like Physicians Without Borders and Lawyers for Human Rights and so forth to suggest that unless you're part of the Catholic Church animated by charity, what you're doing is really not quite up to snuff. At least that's the way I interpret the encyclical. And I don't think it's fair to the efforts of non-Christians and non-religious people for the justice they do in the world. Related to this is, it seems to me certainly naive and almost on the edge of intentional distortion to talk about politics as if it's outside the church, whereas in fact inside the Holy See is about as political a place as you can find in the world. It's every bit as political as Congress. And along with that, the notion that the church can be concerned about about charity, but justice is the problem of the world. In fact, there's justice in the church. We should talk about as a bottom line for proving that you really have charity. Because charity is not just sentiment. It's not just nice feelings. It's not just prayers. It's action. So that's an assertion on my part. I think it's an important one for me. My question is, given his understanding of charity and justice, what do you think Pope Benedict is going to say about the move to canonize Archbishop Oscar Romero, who did not try to confine his ministry to charity, but understood charity first and foremost as expressed in justice for the poor?
Go ahead.
I don't have, it's a guess on my part, but this was a piece that I wanted to say in the talk, but I didn't want to take much time. And it may sound like a very abstruse example, but I think that he won't move to canonize Oscar Romero unless there is a similar kind of pressure put on. And I'm basing that basically on what's happened to Father Gerard Jean-Just in Haiti. I don't know if you know about him, but he has been imprisoned. He has leukemia. Through the helpful work of Paul Farmer, whom we all know here at BC, he was able to get released from prison. He was accused of murder. He's very much a supporter of Aristide. And there was rumor that actually, before the recent election in Haiti, that people wanted to elect him. Now, that, of course, is a big no-no. We all remember John Paul II's finger wagging at Ernesto Cardenal, or at least some of us remember, in Nicaragua. And what has happened since then, he's now in Miami receiving treatment for the leukemia, thanks to Dr. Paul Farmer. But his bishop, who's actually a good friend of his, Bishop Mio, has taken away his faculties to celebrate the Eucharist. And the reason that was given was because he had gotten involved in partisan politics and that he was running for office. Now, he denies this, and what I've been able to find out through people that I know very involved in Haiti, my community has connections there, is that actually Mio was put in this position of doing this because of other bishops who had been passed over to become the ordinary of Port-au-Prince. And so this has been brought by some other bishops in the United States to the Congregation for the Clergy, and the head of that congregation, has sort of passed it off to someone else. And this is what I meant before when I meant, is Pope Benedict XVI really sort of flying above the fray? And there are others within the Curia, and this is where I see the politics you're bringing out, Steve. And this does reach into also then, national and international politics of operating, this way that let these other people, in a sense, do the dirty work, and then he won't have to take any position or any claim on it. So that's something I have some concern about. It's a very specific case, but I have heard it can be replicated in other instances about other issues, not so much about a priest's involvement in politics or not, and what is construed as politics. This is a man who basically lives and works with the poor in the most dire conditions, and had absolutely no desire to be president of Haiti. But it also exists in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, where, of course, the Pope has appointed his very good friend, now Cardinal Leveda, who really knows the theological scene in the United States. And so we won't have Benedict, I don't think, calling on the carpet theologians, but we have William Leveda, who actually also is a surprising character. I mean, in some ways he's very good, particularly on ecumenical issues. But anyway, I just say I share that same concern, and I also want to say I loved the first part of the encyclical. I was very inspired by it, but also disappointed, particularly with the disconnect there between charity and justice.
Steve, if I could just make a quick comment. I think your question's a great one. I think it points up, however, the politics of saint-making since we began to make saints, especially at an official level. There was a time when saints emerged from the faith life of the common people, and you were declared a saint by their devotion and by their attesting to the holiness of your life and the miracles they received when they prayed and asked you to pray with them. So the politics of saint-making is in some ways a scandal in our church. I mean, none of the great holy men and women that we have known throughout our lives, grandparents, great-grandparents, will ever be sainted unless they founded some kind of a religious order. They're the only ones, really, of the 400 and something that John Paul II raised to the altars. I think 412 of them, just about 98% of them, were people who had vowed religious communities of some kind or other, which is a great mode of sanctity in our tradition, but surely not the only one. It reminds me of the old lectionary, or the old sacramentary, where there were virgins, there were martyrs, there were confessors of the faith, but then when it came to married people, Bridget of Sweden and Elizabeth of Hungary, they were referred to neither virgin nor martyr was the designation of it. They couldn't say married. Neither virgin nor martyr was a real achievement, but nonetheless. But my answer, though, my bottom line answer would be that I think if Oscar Romero, if his case proceeds and he comes up with the 2 or whatever it is now, 3 first-class miracles that are required for canonization, I think Benedict would canonize him. Will he lobby for it? I think he'll lobby for John Paul II. Will he lobby for Romero, or who will ever lobby for Dorothy Day? But I think my point would be, I think Romero Cardinal Benedict XVI is more likely to play by the rules than John Paul II was. For example, in the canonization of the founder of Opus Dei, who had one first-class miracle attested to by Opus Dei doctors, and even Cardinal Sodano, when he was asked why would John Paul canonize the founder of Opus Dei when he didn't have 3 first-class miracles, and Sodano said, "Oh, the Holy Father, for sanctity, for holiness, indeed, the Holy Father can dispense from 3 first-class miracles, but I didn't know that he could dispense from holiness of life."
Let me just, 2 quick comments, Steve. One is, I have no idea what he's going to do with Romero, and in a certain sense, it's not important to me. The man's life speaks for what it is, doesn't need somebody else to recognize it. But I think behind it, it's the reason I talked about a certain foreboding about this papacy, and that is, I think you find consistently as Joseph Ratzinger, now as Benedict XVI, he has a great concern about what he calls horizontalism. That is, he's very concerned that the church so talks about social action that undercuts verticality in terms of the relationship is so much one's relationship with one's neighbor that he sees that as leading to a neglect of one's relationship with God. And I think that while surely that's something that we ought not to espouse, it seems to me that what it leads to is these great reservations about justice talk and about politics. I think undue caution in that regard. Let me just utter then one little demur about all the praise we're giving Deus Caritas Est. I think it is one of the better encyclicals we've had in recent times, but I'd like to fault it not so much by what it says, but what it omits. And that is, even in that first part that Mary Ann and Tom have been praising, and I agree with it, let me just cite one little point that I find very odd. In the entire encyclical, the word philia never shows up. He talks about eros, he talks about agape. He never talks about philia, never talks about friendship, never talks about love that's genuinely reciprocal. And I think that's a real shortcoming in his understanding of human love.
I agree with all of your comments on Deus Caritas. That's the end of my comment. My question is, I went to hear Bishop Gumbel last night as follows. He, after making the statement that the church cannot change without impetus from the top, he then said, I do believe, however, it will reform itself. And eventually, toward the end of his speech, he dwelled on the subject of the sensus fidelium. This is how it will reform itself, by pressure from below. Now, he didn't go into detail on how one might energize that pressure from below. I'm voice of the faithful, I'm trying. But I'm wondering if you people who are so knowledgeable about Deus Caritas, do any of you think that could be an energizing factor? If your average Catholic owned this encyclical, could it be an energizing factor?
Jimmy hasn't spoken.
Jim.
You want to say anything?
I don't know why they're all turning to me.
Well,
You haven't spoken yet.
Well, I concur with my colleagues that the second part of the encyclical is a disappointment. Having studied Protestant theology, something I always try to present to my students as something that's part of the larger picture, I thought the remarkable thing of the encyclical was that it agreed with a major Protestant theologian in the second part of the encyclical. It agreed with Reinhold Niebuhr that charity and justice are pursuits that can't be easily reconciled, and that charity is a private work and justice is a public work, and the role of the church is more in the private sphere and so forth. And yet in the first part of the encyclical, he counters the leading Protestant paradigm on love by saying that agape and eros flow together. So it's an interest, for somebody who knew Niebuhr's work, as Benedict certainly did, it was an interesting way of rebutting Niebuhr in part one and then supporting Niebuhr in part two. Having said all that, and I'm sure that might have been a little bit confusing to lay people, the answer to your question, I'm saying this as a church historian and as someone who is not a Roman Catholic, the answer is no. I don't see concrete possibilities for reform from below in the Catholic Church. They have historically failed. They have historically been unable to hold their strength. And Benedict himself is sufficiently aware of a similar movement in Austria, something very similar to Voice of the Faithful, which has successfully been dissipated and blocked over the last years. I also think John Paul II's successful barricading of the episcopate by installing people who were pastorally insensitive and ideologically uniform guarantees that the voices from below are not going to be heard. And I think we've seen enough of that in Boston. So I say that with disappointment, but I also say it with some objectivity of historical background.
I'm a little more hopeful with regard to the possibility of change from below than Jim is perhaps. However, I do think that one major problem, and I don't think it's going to come from this encyclical, what you're looking for. One major problem is that we have wonderful rhetoric about the sensus fidelium, but we don't have structures, official structures that actually work because they're all at the, pleasure of the bishop or the ordinary of the diocese for them to be implemented. However, we have actual instances, current and past, that I would like to suggest are dangerous memories that need to be lifted up, particularly in the North American Catholic Church, where we have had what this is not my original idea, but what Brad Hinsey, a theologian who teaches at Fordham, has called practices of dialogue in the Roman Catholic Church. Among these various cases that he gives are the the grassroots reform groups that have grown up since Vatican II, like Voice of the Faithful, like Call to Action, like Future Church. Also, the initiative of Cardinal Bernardine, the Common Ground Initiative, which has actually had criticism from the Episcopate, Cardinal Law among them, for example, but other examples such as the pastoral letters of the Episcopal conferences in the United States, which involved a process of consultation, which, from my point of view, as someone who teaches ecclesiology, was really a way of sort of mining, tapping the sensus fidelium. There are graduate students in our Department of Theology who are very interested in this topic. One of them I see sitting in the back. And I think the more that people, including people in the pews, can get to know that we actually have concrete instances of this and keep reminding ourselves about them. One famous one was the bicentennial consultation of the U.S. Catholic bishops in 1976, which was the original call to action, where we had people from all points of the spectrum in the Catholic Church in the United States coming together with proposals, but then it scared the pants off, or the skirts, maybe I should say, of the bishops when it came to implementing them. And so I think that there is stuff in our history. This is why history is so important, but we need to keep lifting it up and reminding ourselves about it, including even the failed pastoral letter that was attempted to be written on women in church and society. So I still have hope. I also want to mention Women Religious is another case that Hinsey points out in his book. They operate according to structures of dialogue. All religious communities do, but I think especially Women Religious, because there isn't a clerical model, in a sense, in those communities that we have a lot to learn from, not only from them, but any groups that are about this kind of change and modeling it, I think, gives us some hope.
Actually, something else occurs to me to respond to. We tend to focus so much on the American scene. I wish I shared Mary Ann's optimism, and I don't. But one piece of optimism for what you're asking for about, I think, may come from the church in Oceania, in Africa, and in Brazil. The bishops there, even though they were all appointed by John Paul II, the bishops there have become very restless because they simply do not have clergy. Bishops are now boxing tins of communion wafers in old biscuit tins from Great Britain and sending them out to their distant islands, even though they have catechists who are willing to be ordained, male catechists who are willing to be ordained. And apparently the restlessness coming out of Africa, one of the reasons for the synod he's called, Oceania and Brazil, is being heard in Rome. It's not being responded to. But how long they can simply sit on the fact that the bishops want to ordain married laymen is open to question.
Speaking as a political scientist and not as a theologian, I believe that the single most important issue in the world right now is Christian, Jewish, Islamic relations. And so I wanted to ask Ken Himes a question. The Pope went to a synagogue in Germany, and that was a very, very important event with respect to Christian-Jewish relations. The visit to Turkey, however, is a visit to a Muslim-majority country, and there are 20 million Muslims living in Western European countries that are primarily Christian. I know that Cardinal Ratzinger had written about Western European Muslims in ways that were relatively hostile, so that I wonder if a concern with religious freedom wouldn't lead one to try to speak not in Muslim-majority countries, but in countries where Muslims are a minority, and as a minority understand the necessity of freedom to practice their faith, because you need much more freedom if you're a minority religion than if you're a majority religion. And so some similar kind of visits to a mosque in Germany or in Belgium or in Holland, something like that. Could you ever foresee that taking place?
I wouldn't rule it out, Alan, but I do think, and how much of this is just Benedict's agenda and how much of it is other people in the Vatican, I think I couldn't parse that neatly for you, but it does seem to me that there has been a choice to move away from John Paul's fairly conciliatory tone towards Islam and to move towards a style that's a little more confrontational. And the reason I said that I think that's a risk, I don't know what the outcome of that's going to be, for good or for ill. I think there's a risk here. There may be a promise as well, but it's precisely because there are Benedict and others. The comment about Turkey and the European Union was different than this issue of religious freedom. The comment about Turkey is Benedict XVI's vision of Europe is largely it's a Christian civilization, and Turkey, being largely a nation of Islam, simply is not part of, you might say, the ethos of Europe. That's the reason for the reservations about Turkey, at least initially. The comments about the Saudis and others is a matter of religious freedom, and it's precisely on this point, Alan, I think, that from the Vatican's perspective, Muslims enjoy religious freedom in the West, but Christians don't enjoy religious freedom in Islamic nations, and or at least in several of them. And it's precisely for that reason that Benedict and others seem to have concluded that the conciliatory style wasn't making inroads. And perhaps the style that needs to be promoted is more of a direct challenge and sort of saying, look how the West treats Islamic believers, ought not the Arab nations treat Christian believers similarly. And so I do think it's a sort of strategic decision, which, it could backfire, it could succeed. But I do think it's a strategic decision, not only by him, but by others, that perhaps it's time to sort of put some pressure on Arab leadership.
I just would like to add to that in light of these many different concerns, his decision to accept the invitation to visit Turkey in November has enormous significance. That will bear very, very close watching. The stakes, as Ken calls them, the risks, the stakes are extremely high because Turkey wants to use the Vatican as a wedge to enter the European Union. The Vatican wants to use Turkey as a wedge to make the case for the kind of religious pluralism in Islamic countries that is allowed in Turkey. And yet neither of them really wants to give way. Benedict doesn't really want Turkey in the European Union, and Turkey doesn't want the religious question raised. It's a secular state. So that will bear very close watching, not to mention the fact that he'll have the first agreeable encounter with an Orthodox patriarch since Catholic Orthodox relations fell apart under John Paul. So watch Turkey in November.
I would also, just if I may, I spent a week in Beirut in Lebanon in the fall, and the Catholic community in Beirut is as anti-Muslim a community as you could ever find, and they take a certain pleasure in the more confrontational style that they see coming from the Vatican. But in terms of domestic politics in Lebanon, anything that fuels sectarianism is, I mean, there's real bloodshed down that road, and it is really, really dangerous business. So the relationship that the Vatican will have with Christians, especially Catholic Christians in Arab countries, is going to be very important.
It seemed like in some ways Ratzinger was, and not to say too much, but a right-hand man of John Paul II, that at least they had a lot of concerns in common, or their backgrounds also coming out of Vatican II, having a lot of experience in that, and then experiencing a similar kind of change in perspective with regard to Vatican II. Anyway, I guess I'm wondering, does Pope Benedict have any right-hand men or women? Probably not, but right-hand men. And if not right-hand men, even in the sense of successors, not to talk about his death prematurely, but in thinking about who might follow in his footsteps, are there people that he would like to put in place like John Paul II did, or if not so much names as qualities, like are there certain things that he would like to see in the institutional church changing in his own vision of the church?
That's a good question.
Well, I think we don't know, I think, Ray, whether Leveda, the Archbishop Cardinal William Leveda is his right hand, but certainly his appointment of Leveda as the Secretary for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is significant. And it's all relative, but within Roman politics, I think Levada would be seen as somewhat right of center, or somewhat left of center, or at least a centrist. Within the Roman context, he'd be a centrist. So he's not right of center, where Ratzinger himself was typically identified. So in a sense, as I said, this is all relative. I mean, it depends on what you mean by the center. But Levada would be imagined, at least, as slightly to the left of, that's your left, of course, slightly to the left of Ratzinger himself. And even his handling, Levada's handling of the gay adoption issue in San Francisco over the years, as he said himself, he tried to make prudential judgments. Now that he's on the hot seat for it, unfortunately, he's taken another stance. But whether Levada takes on that kind of power with Benedict that Ratzinger had with John Paul remains to be seen. But I don't think he's going to try to groom, to coin a phrase, his successor. I don't think he's going to, because in a sense, John Paul handpicked Ratzinger, and in a sense, now with hindsight, of course, with foresight, I didn't foresee this, but with hindsight, in a sense, he was an inevitable choice. I doubt if Benedict will leave that kind of person in place. I think this is where I said I think he's more likely to be papal rather than grandstanding. And I'd like to think that he doesn't, and I wouldn't be surprised if in fact he leaves, that the next conclave will be a much more open conclave than the last one was.
Just a brief comment. I get this email every day from the Vatican. I must have signed up for it somewhere. And it basically tells you everything the Pope is saying, and it's right from the Vatican website. You can get it. And one of the things I look at all the time is sort of who are the episcopal appointments, if I know anybody, not personally, but auxiliaries. So, for example, I saw Bishop Lennon's just yesterday. And then it says who the Pope is meeting with. And I noticed that he meets with Cardinal Levada every week. And I also subscribe to another list that's run by the Legionaries of Christ, Zenit, which purports to be a news agency from the Vatican. It's all, again, mostly about the papacy. And in it, I saw a little fracas about Cardinal Ruini, who was trying to basically, he's going to retire, and so he's the head of the Roman Episcopal Conference of Italy, and he was trying to sort of send out a referendum, I guess, saying like, who would you like to see as head of this? Which was actually something it's the Pope's prerogative apparently to have some say about this in the Italian ways of things. And so he was not exactly reprimanded, but the Pope then made a statement about how this was going to happen. And so it gave me the impression, at least anyway, that Benedict is very much. I wouldn't say he's going to name his successor. I agree with Tom. I think he's papal, but he's very much aware of who is going to play roles in the Curia and in the Vatican. And so I think he definitely is putting a stamp on those kinds of things.
Just a quick answer, Ray. Just as Jim wisely said, Turkey is the place to watch in November. The person to watch is Cardinal Sodano, the present Secretary of State, is out. Who's going to replace Sodano will tell you a lot about what, because the Secretary of State is the second most important person in the Vatican. Who Benedict XVI picks for that role, that's going to be a telling appointment.
Is he out for age? Is that
Is he out already?
No, he's not out for age. He's clearly out because
Out of favor.
he's out of
Out of
favor.
favor.
And there's going to be a move to remove Sodano.
Just one of the few things I'm good at is internal Vatican politics, but there are three things to watch.
You're good at more than that,
There are
Jim.
there are the three watchwords on this: consultation, experts, and theological. Okay, just 3 points on Benedict. He genuinely means it that he wants to be consultational. Last summer, I was able to have dinner with a couple of cardinals from different parts of Europe. And the one thing that they both said, and which has been widely reported from others as well, is that we got to Rome and we didn't know each other.
Yeah.
We had to follow the one leader who was clearly in charge, which was Ratzinger, leading the daily meetings. So I think he shows that he does not want to groom a successor, but he wants the cardinals to get to know each other better. That's the first thing. Secondly, he's known to prefer experts, so he will put people into office who know what they're doing, not people who've succeeded in other positions and deserve a promotion, which was the case under John Paul II and is traditional in Vatican circles. You're promoted because you've done well somewhere else. Thirdly, you asked about John Paul's own inner circle. Interestingly, they're quite uniform. They're all conservative German theologians, more conservative than himself. Monsignor Genswein, who's his personal secretary, has also taught at the Opus Dei University in Rome. His other associate, whose name escapes me, has also taught at the Opus Dei University in Rome. And these are people with whom he's in daily contact, who dine with him. So he's certainly going to be under that kind of influence. And then finally, there are about 15 major appointments in the Vatican that have to be renewed within the next year because their incumbents are over 75. And as Ken, I think quite correctly said, the Secretariat of State ran that branch of government for the last several years, and Benedict has made it very clear that he's going to take charge. He was always in a kind of a turf war with Cardinal Sodano when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, and so it's quite clear that he'll begin to select his people from outside the circle of the Secretariat of State.
We have two questions, so I'm going to ask you and then you to both give your questions. Then I'll ask our panelists to respond and sum up, and then we'll bring it to a conclusion.
My question in some ways relates to some of the last comments, which is we've heard that Benedict is someone who's willing to listen to others. But I was wondering, is there anything that we can tell so far in terms of, for example, his recent cardinal appointments? What kind of people has he put in place? Are they folks who are listeners? And in some ways that relates to previous comments about, for example, Romero or someone, my familiarity with Latin America, having seen the positive and challenging impact different bishops, for example, can have in terms of the development of the church there. So he's a listener. Is he putting listeners in place?
Go ahead.
I just ask you to comment on the possible reconciliation with the Society of St. Pius X, Archbishop of Graves group. What's in it for the Catholic Church besides the Society of St. Pius X to make this reconciliation? As I understand it, the issue is Vatican II, yes or no. What could happen? What has changed that could make a reconciliation possible?
Thank you. So, answers to the questions and summing up, and now we'll actually go in alphabetical order.
I'll try and be quick.
Almost. No, almost. Go ahead. Try to be quick. And then Tom Groome will try to be quick.
In terms of Lefebvre, I wouldn't know how to predict it. I think it's interesting, though, in terms of listening. When he talked to the cardinals about this, it was cardinals who raised lots of cautions about don't go too fast in terms of reconciliation with Lefebvreites. So I think you were quite right. The issue is the acceptance of all the documents of Vatican II. And in particular, of course, Nostra Aetate is a real sticking point for many people and followers of Cardinal Lefebvre, Archbishop Lefebvre. So I think right now you'd have to say that it's a yellow light blinking, if not a red light, as regards movement on the Lefebvre situation. And it's precisely because he listened, and the concerns came out of the cardinals. In terms of putting people in place, I think it's still too early to tell. Most of this consistory were John Paul II's men, he inherited most of these choices that he had to do. So I think it's just one of those things. It remains to be seen who he'll put in place. I do think, though, that one of the things that's interesting is there were widespread rumors that after the synod on the Eucharist, Benedict XVI was quite unimpressed by the quality of intellectual depth that he's heard in the discussions from the bishops. And I think, given the history, often in Germany, of having scholar bishops, I think you may find that he's going to be looking for people who bring a little bit more intellectual wherewithal to the episcopacy than the tendency that's been the case in many various episcopal conferences, where they appoint people who are good managers, good bureaucrats, good organizational types of people, or good pastoral people. That he's going to be looking for people who bring some intellectual depth to the hierarchy.
3 quick comments. The fact that he reached out to Hans Kung and to the Lefebvrites, I think bespeaks a more Catholic church. Indeed, an inclusive one where all are welcome, left, right, and centre. I agree with Ken, if the Lefebvrites return, they have to accept the documents of Vatican II in spirit and in text. Second question, I don't think there were any surprises in the recent consistory of cardinals. I was asked, but isn't it a surprise that the Archbishop of Boston isn't it surprising that John O'Malley was made a cardinal? I said, no. If the Bishop of Worcester or Fall River was made a cardinal, that'd be a surprise. But the Archbishop of Boston, you expect him to be a cardinal. The only possible surprise or positive sign there was the Archbishop of Hong Kong, who apparently has been stalwart in his championing of human rights on mainland China, and it clearly was a signal on Benedict's part that he supported that project. My closing comment is that I think he may continue to surprise us. He may also continue to disappoint us. But I think we've been fairly surprised this first year, and I think it will continue.
I agree with what's been said. I totally agree.
Any final comment?
Well, I'm curious to see what the effect is what this listening might mean with regard to the U.S. bishops. I mean, I think there's a problem there with regard to even knowing, where the Episcopal Conference is right now today, and who does represent these kind of, more educated voices. I mean, I think the Episcopal appointments, by and large, in the United States have been abysmal under John Paul II, and so it'll be very interesting to see who's going to exercise the kind of power that you saw exercised by Law and Regali, and I mean, they're in different places or in some in the same place. So that's a question I have, and I don't know what that's going to mean with regard to Benedict.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with what my colleagues have said. Your specific question was, are the new cardinals good listeners? And I just ran through them in my mind, and the short answer is no. I mean, specifically the Bishop of Hong Kong. He's actually not an archbishop. The Bishop of Hong Kong is known for being very in your face. He's not known as being a listener. The only one who is a listener, obviously and significantly, is Cardinal Leveda. His time in San Francisco was plagued by issues with the gay community, and he rode them out very harmoniously, to the surprise of many. But I do think that the watchword is to look for experts who are going to be chosen to lead new offices and to lead experts to lead the offices in the Vatican. A number of offices in the Vatican are going to be shut down. A couple have already been merged. And so I think you'll see a number of people who are relatively unknown coming to the forward. And the places to watch in the United States in the next year will be Washington and Detroit. Both of their archbishops hold cardinalatial rank and are due for retirement. So those will be the bellwethers. An initial suggestion about the new Archbishop of Washington is very discouraging, but that's just at the stage of ecclesiastical gossip. But those will be the two appointments to watch.
Well, I think all your comments suggest that we should reconvene in another year. Make it an annual event. See where we are. I know that Pope Benedict is quaking in his pants, waiting to be evaluated by us here at Boston College.
She's even going to be.
I think it's enormously important that we hold this kind of event, and I just speaking for myself, but I'm sure for the people in the room, I'm enormously grateful to the four of you for coming this afternoon and sharing.